In 2011, a crime shocked the nation and forced the American justice system to confront uncomfortable questions about juvenile offenders. Christian Fernandez, a 12-year-old boy from Jacksonville, Florida, was charged with first-degree murder after the brutal death of his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga. This case was not only harrowing because of the age of the victim, but also due to the age of the perpetrator. Christian became the youngest person in the world to be charged with first-degree murder, surpassing a previous suspect, Lionel Tate, by a year. If you haven't seen that brutal story of a 13-year-old killing a 6-year-old girl yet, watch it here. Christian Fernandez was born into an environment fraught with hardship and instability. His mother, Bianella Susana, was just 14 years old when she gave birth to him, causing Christian's father to be arrested and tried on the charges of sexual assault. So the boy's early years were marked by poverty, violence, and a lack of consistent nurturing care. By the time he was 2, he was found wandering the street, filthy and nude, while his grandmother was found nearby in a cheap motel, surrounded by mountains of cocaine, and his mother nowhere to be seen. By the time he was 5, Christian had experienced unspeakable physical abuse by his stepfather, Luis Galarraga, before committing suicide in front of him before police could arrive. These traumatic incidents left deep psychological scars. Growing up, Christian exhibited signs of severe emotional and psychological distress. He acted out violently, had difficulty forming relationships, and often seemed disconnected from reality. Despite these clear indicators of a troubled child in need of help, Christian's behavior was frequently dismissed or inadequately addressed by those around him. He cycled through the juvenile justice system, and his behavior grew increasingly erratic and dangerous. On March 14, 2011, Christian Fernandez was left alone with his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga, while their mother ran errands. During this time, Christian allegedly became frustrated with David's crying while practicing yoga moves he'd seen a cousin perform previously, and responded by slamming the toddler's head twice into a bookshelf. The force of the impact caused severe head trauma, at first only severe enough to worsen the crying, but after the second, knocked the poor child unconscious and caused severe cranial swelling, as well as bleeding from his nose and mouth. Christian immediately phoned his mother and lied, saying David had been hit with a knife by someone else. Upon returning home, she found David unresponsive, but rather than seeking immediate medical attention, she attempted to revive him herself, searching the internet for remedies. It wasn't until several hours later that she took David to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The delay in seeking medical help raised suspicions among medical staff, who alerted the authorities. The extent of David's injuries was shocking. On top of the swelling, the toddler suffered a fractured skull and significant internal hemorrhaging. These injuries were inconsistent with an accidental death and suggested an all-too deliberate act of violence. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office quickly launched an investigation. Christian was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. The case drew national attention due to Christian's young age and the severity of the charges. Prosecutors argued that Christian had a history of violent behavior and that his actions were premeditated. They pointed to his past disciplinary issues and the severity of David's injuries as evidence of his intent to harm. However, Christian's defense team painted a different picture. They argued that Christian was a product of his environment, a child who had been repeatedly failed by the adults in his life. They highlighted his traumatic upbringing, his exposure to violence, and his untreated psychological issues. The defense contended that Christian did not fully comprehend the consequences of his actions, and that his mother, Bianella, bore significant responsibility for leaving him unsupervised with a vulnerable toddler. Christian's trial would therefore become a media spectacle, with public opinion sharply divided on whether he should be held fully accountable for his actions. In 2013, Facing the possibility of a life sentence, Christian accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter and aggravated battery, receiving a sentence of juvenile detention until his 19th birthday, followed by probation. Critics argued that the justice system had failed to consider the full context of Christian's life and the psychological trauma he had endured. They questioned whether a 12-year-old could truly understand the gravity of his actions and whether the legal proceedings had adequately addressed his need for rehabilitation rather than punishment. His mother, on the other hand, was found guilty of child negligence and was sentenced to 10 years probation as part of a separate trial for the death of her child. When it comes to understanding why Christian committed such a horrific act, we are required to delve into a deep examination of his psychological and social environment. Christian's history of violence and behavioral problems suggest underlying issues that were not adequately addressed. Some experts argue that his actions were influenced by exposure to violence and a lack of proper supervision and discipline. The defense's argument that Christian's actions were a desperate cry for help reflects a potential disconnect between understanding reality and fiction. However, the question of motive is complicated. Was Christian fully aware of the consequences of his actions? Did he understand the fragility of a 2-year-old's body? These questions are crucial in assessing his culpability. The prosecution's reliance on first-degree murder charges circumvented these considerations, focusing solely on the outcome rather than intent. Bianella Susana's role in this tragedy cannot be overlooked. As a mother, she bore a significant responsibility for the children's well-being. Her decision to leave a troubled and violent child alone with a vulnerable toddler raises serious questions about her judgment and awareness. Bianella's initial attempt to treat David's injuries at home and delay in seeking medical help were critical lapses that certainly contributed to David's death. Furthermore, Bianella's history of neglect and her own traumatic experiences influenced her parenting decisions. She had been a victim of abuse and neglect herself, which likely impacted her ability to provide a stable and safe environment for her children. While her actions were not excusable, they highlight the cycle of trauma and neglect that can perpetuate through multiple family members. Thus, our story is less of a single suspect and more an entire bloodline consisting of generational trauma and poor decisions. Ultimately, Christian Fernandez's young life was derailed by a combination of personal failings and systemic shortcomings. While his actions were undeniably horrific, the broader context of his upbringing, environment, and the decisions made by those around him complicate the narrative. As we reflect on this case, we must consider the balance between justice and compassion and the critical role of support systems in preventing such tragedies. If you were moved by this tragic story, stay tuned for our next tale, an act of parricide by a troubled teen who'd gone looking for an extreme way to end the day-to-day life he hated to the point of cold, callous rage. But beware, this story is only for the most daring viewers. Subscribe if you dare.